I welcome here today on the stage Dr. Miriam Lowe from the African Studies Department. She's going to be giving our opening remarks and a land acknowledgement today. So everyone give a hand for Dr. Miriam Lowe.
These greetings are conveyed to you in every single language possible. Can you try to respond back to me and greet me back? I want to hear as many languages as possible.
To our guests and to our wonderful sister, colleague, and friend.
University of Toronto and a powerful advocate for the Sudanese community here at UofT and beyond. She's currently serving her third term as an executive member of the Student Union as co-president this year. I also have the pleasure of having her as a student last year. The war in Sudan is not unique in the ways it is being naturalized, depoliticized, and decontextualized, as other wars on the African continent have been, such that the linkages between, say, a Montreal-based PR firm that represented the Rapid Support Forces in 2019, right after it culminated a massacre with the army, dismantling the revolutionary sit-in that overthrew dictator Omar al-Bashir after 30 years in power and the current counter-revolution, between what is happening in Sudan, Palestine, Congo, Haiti, etc., in terms of those profiting from war. We are fortunate today that our speakers will be doing the opposite, by denaturalizing this war and by providing important context for us to better understand its roots and contours. We know, of course, that more mainstream media coverage of what's happening in Sudan, particularly in North America, does not necessarily mean people will become more informed or feel moved to act in defense of life as opposed to its destruction. The US and Canadian coverage of Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza is a case study in how to manufacture consent and to legitimize continued support for genocide from one settler colonial state to another. In the case of Sudan, and this is partly structured by racism, neglect operates similarly to manufacture organized abandonment, which Ruthie and Craig Gilmore define as a, quote, intentional divestment in communities that creates opportunities for extraction and revenue generation. This organized abandonment does several things. It conceals the internationalized counter-revolutionary nature of this war. Gold and gum Arabic have boomed since the war started, creating profit margins for Sudanese and foreign elites that are now significantly higher than when the war began. It allows the fact that only 26% of the UN's $4 billion aid appeal has been funded by the powers that be to go largely unnoticed and uncontested, placing a huge burden on Sudanese civilians who are being starved, attacked, and besieged to organize for their own survival. But the antidote to organized abandonment is organized care. There's organized care. There's the organized care of ordinary Sudanese coming together to fulfill the food, shelter, and healthcare needs of millions nationwide with very limited resources. These organizers are insisting on staying put in the middle of a war zone, on living and on sustaining each other to live amidst the threats of death, sexual violence, and torture. There is also the organized care of Sudanese activists in the diaspora, like Husam and Dr. Iman, who are tirelessly educating and mobilizing communities across North America to act, which given the media blackout is particularly challenging. And then there's the organized care of people like you, standing in solidarity with people in Sudan by attending this event. A Sudan Bukra TV channel, journalist, writer, and telecom professional. He's based in Austin, Texas, where he writes on politics, economics, international relations, and human rights. He's written extensively about the role of the UAE in particular in fueling this war, and has done tremendous work to combat misinformation and propaganda around it. Dr. Iman Ahmed is a Sudanese-Canadian global health and international migration expert with experience in humanitarian aid and international development. Her interests include population health, human rights, climate change, and refugee issues. She is a powerful feminist activist and has done incredible work supporting the Sudanese Doctors Union. Before I hand it over to them, I would like to invite Rania Al-Fil from the Sudanese Canadian Community Association, who spearheaded this speaking tour, to say a few words of welcome. Rania is a technology technology transformation professional by day, and a powerful advocate for Sudan on immigration pathways, humanitarian issues, and foreign policy with the IRCC and other government partners by night. Please join me in welcoming Lamia.
Thank you and welcome, everyone. It's a very tough to follow Professor Miriam Law and good friend CNNE. Thank you so much, but I'll try to bring those families here to their loved ones. That's the soonest that
between the SAF, Sudanese Armed Forces, and RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, were already escalating. Both sought to consolidate power, both distrusted the other, and both prepared for confrontation. Thus, the outbreak of war in April 2023 was not a sudden rupture. It was the culmination of decades of militarization, the legacies of Darfur and the failures of the 2019 transition. Sudan's elites repeatedly placed their survival above democratic reform. International actors, whether Western governments content with surface-level stability or Gulf states intent on securing their influence, reinforced these dynamics. At its heart, Sudan's crisis is about who controls the state and its resources, and whether the aspirations of its people can ever triumph over military and paramilitary power. To reduce the conflict to ethnic tensions or tribal rivalries is to miss the essential truth. The war is the product of political choices by Sudanese generals who armed militias instead of building institutions and who consistently undermine democratic transformation and the people's aspirations in pursuit of their own material wealth and survival. By Gulf states that sought to counter Sudan's revolution, opposed any genuine democratic transition, and treated the country as a frontier for their wealth and ambitions. And by international powers that prioritize counterterrorism, migration control, and their broader geopolitical agendas, including preserving close ties with the Gulf states over supporting real democracy. The war we see today is not inevitable. It is literally man-made. It was produced by the failures of post-colonial elites, by Bashir's decades of divide and rule, by the impunity granted to Janjaweed violence, by the aborted revolution of 2018-2019, by compromises that left two armed institutions, the SAF and the RSF, facing off without any civilian authority strong enough to restrain them, and by a counter-revolutionary geopolitical neighborhood. Sudan's neglected war then cannot be understood without this longer history. It's not a crisis born in 2023. It is the latest chapter in a long struggle over who rules Sudan, who controls its resources, how its people are treated, and whether the demands of freedom, peace, and justice will ever be realized. Next slide, please. Anyway. So the war that erupted in April 2023 did not catch Sudanese people by surprise. For months, the tensions between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces had been mounting. The transitional framework negotiated in late 2022 was supposed to bring the military under civilian oversight and unify the armed forces. But embedded within that process was the most explosive question: what to do with the RSF? The RSF was no ordinary militia. It was a paramilitary empire created from the Janjaweed militias in Darfur, formalized by Bashir, enriched by Sudan's gold trade, and empowered by external patrons like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the European Union. Its commander, Hemeti, was not only Burhan's deputy in the Sovereignty Council, he was also Sudan's most powerful warlord, commanding more than 100,000 fighters and controlling significant financial networks. The army under General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan regarded RSF integration as both necessary and dangerous. The question was not if integration would happen, but how and under whose terms. By early 2023, the debate over integration had escalated into an existential struggle. The immediate dispute centered on timing. The SAF demanded a 2-year process to neutralize Hemeti's autonomy before it grew further, while Hemeti and the RSF pushed for a 10-year horizon, seeing rapid integration as a path of marginalization or dismantlement. Yet, the deeper fault line lay in the chain of command. The SAF insisted that the RSF must answer directly to the army commander, whereas the Rapid Support Forces argued it should report only to a civilian head of state. What appeared to be a technical issue of military reform was in fact the spark that ignited open war. On April 15, 2023, fighting erupted in Khartoum and across Sudan. The scale and speed of the war shocked outsiders, but many Sudanese had long expected a clash, even if not at this intensity or pace. For months, the tensions had been mounting, and people feared that the fragile framework talks would collapse. RSF forces attacked strategic sites in the capital, the airport, the presidential palace, and military headquarters. SAF responded with heavy artillery and airstrikes. What remains contested, however, is the question of who fired the first bullet. Some point to the SAF, others to the RSF, and still others to remnants of the old regime seeking to ignite conflict. This unresolved question continues to divide Sudanese civilians, fueling polarization and endless debates, even though the deeper reality is that war was already inevitable given the trajectory of rivalry and mistrust. What began as a clash between two armed institutions quickly engulfed to neighborhoods, markets, and civilian infrastructure. Khartoum, once the political center of Sudan, became the primary battlefield. Unlike previous wars fought in the peripheries, this conflict was waged in the heart of the capital. Residents found themselves trapped between RSF fighters occupying houses and SAF warplanes bombing indiscriminately. Hospitals were targeted, power grids collapsed, and food supplies dwindled. The capital city, long shielded from the violence suffered in South Sudan before its independence, or in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, now experienced what those regions had endured for decades. The nature of the fighting in Khartoum revealed the asymmetry between the two forces. The RSF relied on mobility, guerrilla tactics, and control of key urban air spaces. The army leaned on its air power and institutional resources, but it was slow to adapt to street-level combat. Neither side prioritized civilian protection. For the people of Khartoum, the war was not a contest of liberation, but a struggle between two armed institutions willing to sacrifice the city itself for control. While Khartoum drew international attention, the war's most devastating violence unfolded in Darfur. There, the RSF reverted to its origins: ethnic-based targeting, massacres of non-Arab communities, systematic sexual violence, and forced displacement. Reports from El Geneina and other towns echoed the horrors of the early 2000s. Entire communities were burned, survivors fled to Chad, and international monitors warned of genocide. The continuity was striking. The same militia that had committed atrocities under Bashir were now acting under Hemeti's command with greater resources and international connections. The world's failure to hold the Janjaweed accountable 2 decades earlier made possible the atrocities of 2023. Impunity had reproduced itself. Sudan's war, though rooted in internal fractures, has never been purely domestic. From the outset, it was shaped by a regional counter-revolutionary axis. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt played central roles in empowering Sudan's generals. The RSF was enriched through gold exports tied to the UAE, while the SAF leaned on Egypt, which feared the RSF's rise and sought to secure its southern border. Saudi Arabia initially positioned itself as a mediator, but gradually tilted more towards the SAF, prioritizing stability above all else. Russia first backed the RSF through its Wagner group, but later aligned with the SAF to preserve state ties and secure access to the Red Sea. Other actors, including Chad, Libya's Haftar militia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Qatar, Turkey, and Iran, also shaped the battlefield through logistics, resources, diplomacy, or mediation efforts aligned with their own agendas. The war's nature was regionalized from the start. It was not only a contest for Khartoum, it was part of a wider struggle over Red Sea routes, resource flows, and geopolitical influence. What makes Sudan's war distinct is not only its brutality, but its double character. It's simultaneously a war of elites, two armed institutions fighting for control of the state, and war that devastates ordinary people who neither chose nor benefit from it. It is also a war with layered dimensions. Local, rooted in Sudan's long crisis of governance and unequal development and failed nation building; regional, entangled with Gulf rivalries, Egyptian fears, and the complexities of the Horn of Africa and the Sahel region; global, neglected by Western powers whose limited interventions signal both disinterest and complicity. This layered nature explains why the war is so neglected. It is complex, but not in the way outsiders claim. The complexity is not ethnic or religious chaos, but the convergence of military ambition, political opportunism, resource wealth, and international indifference. The neglect serves those who profit from it. Generals and businessmen who pillage without accountability, Gulf states that secure gold and strategic corridors, and international powers that avoid responsibility while maintaining selective engagement. The outbreak of war in April 2023 marked a new chapter, but it was not a break from the past. It was a continuation of patterns set decades earlier: militarization, impunity, external indifference. What is different is the scale, the collapse of Khartoum, the fragmentation of the state, the open contest between two military elites with no civilian authority strong enough to constrain them. This is the nature of Sudan's war: confrontation born of political failure, sustained by external enablers, and paid for by the lives of ordinary Sudanese people. No, the one before that. Okay. To understand the persistence of the war, we need to look closely at the actors inside Sudan. This is not a leaderless conflict. It is driven by identifiable institutions, commanders, and political forces, each with distinct interests, calculations, and external patterns. At the center stand the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. Around them orbit fragmented civilian groups, political parties, remnants of trade unions and professional associations, grassroots resistance committees, and what is left of a hollowed out state. The Sudanese armed forces presents itself as the guardian of Sudanese sovereignty and the embodiment of the state. In reality, it is a politicized military institution whose leadership has repeatedly intervened to preserve its privileges. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, now the face of the SAF, rose through Bashir's wars in Darfur and is widely viewed as aligned with or being a member of the Islamist and old regime networks. Yet, the rank and file of the army reflects Sudan's broader social fabric, drawing recruits from across the country. As the war deepened, many ordinary citizens, including members of grassroots organizations and local communities, joined SAF units or allied militias when they felt they had no other option but to resist the RSF's advances. Also, at the onset of the war, cadres and supporters of the old regime have re-emerged visibly, rallying behind the SAF and often fighting alongside it, either within its ranks or through Islamist militias mobilized in its support. Structurally, the SAF commands heavy weaponry, air power, and institutional base in the state bureaucracy, but it suffers from corruption, foreign interference, and declining legitimacy. Its record of coups and repression undermines its claim to represent the nation. Burhan, in particular, has tried to balance between asserting authority and accommodating powerful officers, often producing paralysis rather than reform. Egypt has provided consistent political backing to Sudan's military, seeing the SAF as a natural ally and a buffer against instability on its southern flank. Many observers also believe this support has extended to military assistance, though the scope of such involvement remains debated. This highlights both SAF's strength and its vulnerabilities. While it can draw on regional allies for political and possibly military cover, its inability to decisively defeat the RSF exposes its enduring dependence on external partners. Within Sudan, the SAF leans on narratives of national unity and resistance to foreign interference, even as its own history is deeply entangled with regional and international agendas. If the SAF represents the old state, the RSF is the monster the old state created. Born out of the Janjaweed militias in Darfur, the RSF was formalized under al-Bashir as a paramilitary force designed to counterbalance the army and suppress dissent. Under Hemeti's leadership, it evolved into a sprawling enterprise, controlling gold mines, running smuggling networks, and deploying mercenaries to fight in Yemen and Libya. The RSF also benefited from cooperation with the European Union anti-illegal immigration programs, which provided resources and legitimacy under the guise of migration control. Its financial lifeline came through gold exports routed via Dubai, which gave it a war chest to recruit, arm, and sustain over 100,000 fighters. Before the war, many ordinary Sudanese, mainly from Darfur, joined because the RSF salaries far exceeded what local agriculture or livestock herding could provide. After the war broke out, recruitment expanded. People from Darfur, Kordofan in the west, and the wider Sahel region enlisted to loot, to profit from the war economy, or for ethnic solidarity. Ironically, some communities historically targeted by Janjaweed attacks also joined, seeing in the RSF an opportunity to strike back against a repressive state and an army that had long brutalized them. It is important also to highlight that the RSF also includes key figures from the Islamist old regime. By 2023, the RSF was not just a paramilitary, it was a parallel state with its own economy, intelligence networks, and foreign relations. Hemeti cultivated ties with the UAE, which provided financial backing and political cover. He sought to rebrand after the December Revolution as a supporter of civilian demands, casting himself as an outsider to Khartoum's elites. This opportunistic populism won him temporary allies, but did not erase the RSF's record of atrocities. In the war, its tactics, urban occupations, scorched earth in Darfur, underscored its militia roots, ruthlessness, and adaptability. Underscored its militia roots and ruthless and adaptability. Sudan civilians remain divided but vital. The political parties that negotiated the 2019 transition, the Forces of Freedom and Change, FFC, saw their white popular support decline steadily after the power sharing agreement with the military in 2019 and throughout the transitional period. Many Sudanese came to view them as too willing to bargain with generals and too dependent on foreign actors. Their standing fell further after the October 2021 coup, which exposed their limited ability to restrain the military or deliver on the revolution's promises. Yet, outside elite politics, grassroots resistance committees have shown remarkable endurance. They continue to mobilize protests, coordinate relief efforts, and articulate visions of civilian democracy. In the midst of the war, these groups have organized emergency response rooms, providing food, medicine, and information to besieged communities. Their resilience keeps alive the possibility of a civilian-led future, even as armed actors dominate the battlefield. The civilian landscape is broad. It includes political parties, secular, Islamic, liberal, traditional, trade unions, professional bodies, women's groups, local demand-based groups, diaspora activists, and traditional leaders, tribal and religious, who still command influence in many communities. But fragmentation remains the central challenge. International mediators have compounded this by consistently treating the SAF and the RSF as the real power brokers, while also choosing to engage with a narrow circle of favored civilians, sidelining others. This selective approach has weakened the broader civilian front, eroded credibility, and further distanced elites from the popular base. It is a mistake. The war cannot be resolved by military bargains and elite deals alone. Civilian agency is indispensable. The interplay between those actors explains the war stalemate. SAF has the institutional shell of the state and external support from Egypt. RSF has mobility financing and backing from the UAE. Civilians have legitimacy and resilience but lack military power. Each actor can prevent the others from achieving decisive victory, but none can unilaterally impose peace. This deadlock ensures protection. It also explains why international neglect is so damaging. Without external pressure on SAF and the RSF, and without meaningful support for civilians, the war becomes a contest of attrition in which ordinary people pay the price. So the war in Sudan cannot be understood in isolation. It's not only a domestic confrontation between SAF and RSF, it is also a battlefield where external powers project influence, secure resources, and test strategies. In fact, the very neglect of Sudan's international itself is a political act, a reflection of selective attention shaped by these actors' interests. Among the external actors, the United Arab Emirates, UAE, has emerged as the most consequential. Abu Dhabi has positioned itself as the RSF's primary backer, providing weapons and logistics in addition to public relations, diplomatic, political, and financial cover. This support is not carried out by the UAE alone. It has enlisted Chad, Libya's Haftar militia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Puntland, the autonomous region in Somalia, and others as part of the logistical and weapons pipeline sustaining the RSF. For the UAE, Sudan is not merely a neighbor across the Red Sea. It is a strategic frontier in its broader project of sub-imperial expansion across Africa. A sub-imperialist country is not a global imperial power, yet behaves as an imperialist within its own region, and also aligns its actions with the interests of imperial powers. In the case of the UAE, its region of influence is the Middle East and Africa, and the imperialist power backing the UAE is the United States. Gold is central to this story. Sudan is a major producer of gold, much of it extracted from RSF-controlled mines in Darfur, smuggled to Dubai. The Sudanese gold enters global markets, providing the RSF with hard currency to sustain its war. In return, the UAE gains not only wealth, but also leverage. The gold for arms exchange ties Sudan's war directly to international financial circuits. Beyond gold, the UAE sees Sudan as a critical node in its continent-wide strategy of port and logistics dominance. The UAE has invested not only in Red Sea projects like Port Sudan and Berbera, but also in ports, airports, and logistical hubs stretching across Africa, from West Africa to the Indian Ocean. These investments are not simply commercial. They are designed to secure influence over Africa's trade routes and embed the UAE as a gatekeeper in global supply chains. Supporting the RSF gives Abu Dhabi a pliable proxy capable of defending these interests on the ground. At the same time, by fueling conflict, the UAE ensures that Sudan's democratic forces remain weak, blocking the possibility of a successful civilian transition that could inspire dissent at home or inspire it in the region. This demonstrates the UAE's role is not incidental or opportunistic, but systematic, tied to an imperial logic in which Sudanese lives are expandable for regional power and global leverage. Saudi Arabia's role is more ambiguous. Riyadh has long-standing ties into Sudan, rooted in religious networks, labor migration, and investment. During the Yemen war, Sudanese troops, many of them RSF recruits, fought as part of the Saudi-led coalition. Since Sudan's war broke out, however, Saudi policy has been less about direct military and political backing and more about mediation. Hosting the Jeddah talks in 2023, Riyadh presented itself as a broker between the SAF and the RSF, often in partnership with the United States. Still, Saudi Arabia's balancing act masks a careful strategic calculus. On the one hand, Riyadh does not want the RSF and by extension, the UAE to dominate Sudan, as that would tilt the Red Sea balance too far towards Abu Dhabi. On the other hand, Sudan is just one among many issues shaping the Saudi-UAE relationship. While Riyadh is willing to compete with Abu Dhabi for influence, it does not treat Sudan as a top-tier priority compared to other theaters. The result has been a cautious, uneven policy, mediation rather than decisive pressure, engagement rather than full commitment to Sudanese civilians or the army. Egypt's position is more straightforward. Cairo views Sudan primarily through the lens of national security, and the SAF as an institutional military partner is its natural ally, Egypt's natural ally. Egypt fears the rise of the RSF as a destabilizing force on its southern border and sees Sudan's fragmentation as a direct threat that could spill instability northward. Yet, Egypt's leverage is limited. Its economy is in deep crisis, its military stretched, and its regime heavily dependent on financial and economic backing from Gulf states, particularly the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and at times Qatar. This makes Cairo's position more complex. It must balance its national security concerns in Sudan with the reality that its own regime survival depends on the very Gulf powers that are themselves divided and in competition over Sudan. While Egypt provides Burhan with clear political backing, claims of intelligence cooperation and occasional military aid remain uncertain. What is certain is that Cairo's support for the RSF also reflects its domestic anxieties. A democratic Sudan would be a dangerous precedent for Egyptians still living under Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's authoritarian rule. Supporting the SAF is therefore not only about securing borders, but also about preserving the regional status quo in which military regimes continue to dominate over civilian aspirations. Russia has long cultivated ties with Sudan. During Bashir's era, the Wagner Group, Moscow's mercenary arm, entrenched itself in Sudan's gold sector. When the war broke out, it initially aligned itself with Hemeti and the RSF, channeling arms, training, and revenues from smuggling. Over time, however, and especially after the war escalated, Moscow recalibrated and shifted its political and diplomatic backing toward Burhan and the SAF, the de facto government, in order to safeguard state-to-state relations and preserve the prospects of a naval foothold in the Red Sea. For Russia, Sudan is valuable for three main reasons: gold, military access to the Red Sea, and geopolitical leverage in Africa. Bashir once promised Moscow a naval base in Port Sudan. The deal collapsed, but the idea persists. By maintaining networks in Sudan, Russia signals that it remains a player in Africa despite Western sanctions. Western powers have treated Sudan with a mix of caution, neglect, and repeated failures. So after the 2019, the United States, the European Union held the transitional government as a model, but provided little material support. When the 2021 coup occurred, they condemned it, but quickly resumed engagement with Burhan and Hemeti, prioritizing stability over accountability. Since the war began, their responses have been muted. Sanctions piecemeal, humanitarian aid underfunded, and diplomatic pressure inconsistent. Compare this to Ukraine, where extraordinary resources were mobilized, or Gaza, where even amid complicity, there is constant political attention. Sudan, by contrast, has been sidelined. This neglect is not neutral. It reflects double standards and a deeper historical pattern. The international community has consistently failed to build peace in Sudan. from the CPA to Darfur to the transitional period by empowering armed elites through elite bargains, sidelining society, and mistaking power sharing for genuine political settlements. As Sharat Srinivasan, a professor in the University of Cambridge, has argued, this kind of liberal peacemaking kills politics. It entrenches coercive actors, marginalizes grassroots constituencies, and generates new wars rather than ending old ones. Today, these mistakes are being repeated, compounded by a new layer of delegation. For Washington, London, and Brussels, Sudan is not as important as their relationships with the Gulf. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are seen as indispensable partners for energy, investment, arms, and regional stability. Sudan is treated as their backyard. This effectively outsources Sudan policy to Gulf capitals, where counter-revolutionary agendas dominate. For the Gulf, Sudan is a high priority frontier. For Western powers, it is expandable compared to the value of their Gulf alliances. Sudanese civilians pay the price. They are told to negotiate with the very generals who killed them. Atrocities in Darfur are described as tragic, but rarely trigger urgent action, even with clear UN Security Council resolutions like the one that demands the RSF to hold its siege of al-Fashir. Instead of re-energizing Sudanese politics, international mediations once again narrows the arena to armed leaders and their chosen civilian allies, displacing society in favor of elite bargains. Peace in Sudan cannot be made by empowering those with guns while sidelining society. Until Western actors stop supporting Sudan's future, stop subcontracting Sudan's future to Gulf powers and start backing broad, accountable civilian politics, their engagement will remain part of the problem, not the solution. It is important here to highlight Canada's efforts in resettling thousands of Sudanese refugees impacted by the war in Canada and the humanitarian assistance it's providing to the Sudanese people. I think that we can all agree that more is needed, especially that the Canadian government must ensure that no Canadian-made weapons, like those manufactured by Straight Group, are funneled through the UAE, ending up in the hands of the RSF. Regional organizations have also failed Sudan. The African Union and IGAD, the East African Bloc, launched mediation efforts, but was divided internally, with member states backing different sides. Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda often found themselves at odds with Egypt, Eritrea, and Sudan itself. The result has been weak, fragmented diplomacy. Civilian groups complain of being excluded, while SAF and RSF exploit divisions to buy time. Regional mediation has produced statements and roadmaps, but little enforcement. So I'll finish now. How much time do I have? Huh? Okay, yeah. So amidst the devastation of war, it is easy to reduce. So I forgot to turn on my timer. So stopwatch. So yeah. Amidst the devastation of war, it is easy to reduce Sudan to a battlefield between two armed institutions. Yet doing so erases the most vital actors in the country, its civilians. For decades, Sudanese people have resisted authoritarianism, built grassroots networks, and kept alive the dream of a democratic future. Even today, under bombardment and displacement, they continue to organize. At the core of this civilian resilience are the resistance committees. Born in the neighborhoods of Khartoum and across the country during the December Revolution, these groups are decentralized, horizontal, and deeply embedded in local communities. They organized protests that brought down Bashir, coordinated sit-ins that pressured the generals, and articulated political visions rooted in accountability and democracy. When the war began, the committees adapted. They established the emergency response rooms that distributed food, medicine, safe passages, and information. They connect neighborhoods under siege, provide shelter for displaced families, and document human rights abuses. In the absence of a functional state, the committees are the closest thing many communities have to governance. What makes them remarkable is not only their capacity, but their ethos. They reject militarism, reject sectarianism, and insist that Sudan's future must be civilian and democratic. In a political landscape dominated by guns, they represent a radically different vision. Sudan's tradition of organized resistance goes beyond the committees. Trade unions have historically played a crucial role in uprisings from 1964 to 1985 to 2019. Despite repression, professional associations of doctors, teachers, lawyers, engineers continue to mobilize. Their expertise has been indispensable in providing services during war and advocating internationally. Women have been at the forefront of every uprising, challenging not only authoritarianism, but also patriarchal norms. In the December Revolution, women's leadership became iconic. In today's war, women are again central, organizing relief, sustaining families, and demanding accountability for sexual violence used as weapon of war. The Sudanese diaspora has also emerged as a crucial force, spread across the Gulf, Europe, North America, and beyond. Sudanese abroad have lobbied governments, raised funds, and amplified the voices of those inside Sudan. They not only engage in activism, but also sustain countless families inside the country through remittances, which remain a lifeline amid economic collapse. Diaspora activism has kept international attention alive when official diplomacy faltered. While their financial support helps communities on the ground survive, their financial support helps communities on the ground survive the daily realities of war. This is my last piece. And why does this matter? Because any settlement imposed by armed actors alone will not bring lasting peace. This will be my closing remarks. We know this from Sudan's history. Power sharing deals between generals may produce temporary stability, but they entrench impunity and prepare the ground for the next war. Only by centering civilian leadership, the committees, unions, women's groups, and diaspora networks can Sudan move toward genuine transformation. International mediators often overlook this, preferring to deal with SAF and RSF as the real players. But this is precisely the mistake that keeps reproducing crisis. Sudan's civilians have shown extraordinary capacity for self-organization. They are not passive victims. Their inclusion is not optional, it is essential. Sudan's war is devastating, but it has also revealed the resilience of its people. Against militarism, they offer solidarity. Against neglect, they offer persistence. Against despair, they insist that freedom, peace, and justice remain possible. Thank you.
Really thorough analysis of the ongoing war in Sudan. It's difficult to come after such a speaker, but I will do what I know the most, which is talking about the humanitarian situation in Sudan. I wish to start by thanking the host, the African Studies Center, and the organizers, the student union, the Sudanese students, the Sudanese community associations, and everybody who's come here to join us and listen to us talking about Sudan. I know that many of you are doing a lot of solidarity work, so thank you for that, and please keep us in your mind and thoughts and actions all the time. So my presentation is titled, The Humanitarian Situation in Sudan, Complex, Lingering, and Neglected. And that's how I describe it because of all the reasons shared by Husam. Next slide, please. I'll start by providing some background about the Sudan itself and then delve into sector by sector analysis of the humanitarian situation. It's going to be basically a quick overview, and you're welcome to ask questions, and we discuss in the time remaining. So the size of the country, Sudan lies in the heart of Africa. It's situated in Northeast Africa, basically. We have a coastline by the Red Sea, but the rest of the country is mostly landlocked. It's described as relatively landlocked. And that means the other parts of the country have no easy routes for goods and services and export and import of goods to reach these parts. And this has had its bearing on the humanitarian response. The size of the country is around 1.9 million square kilometers. It's the third largest country in Africa, following Algeria and DRC. It used to be the largest country before the secession of South Sudan. And this is not to brag about the size of a country, but to show how difficult it is to reach all the parts of the Sudan now affected by the war. The country is very rich in natural resources, as mentioned by Husam. It hosts the largest stretch of the Nile Valley. That means it's rich in water, fresh water resources, and water is becoming such a rare commodity now around the world. It has vast agricultural land, and it's also rich in gold and other precious metals. Next, please. Quickly, mentioning some of the development indicators, international poverty rates in Sudan are really severe because around 70% of the population is living below the poverty line, which was set at $2.15 a day per person per day in 2017. And I'm aware that it has now been adjusted to $3, but that makes it even harder for the people. 75% of the country's revenues were lost after the secession of South Sudan because of the loss of the oil revenues. And now I will move a little bit to my area, which is public health. The current health expenditure, this is one of the development indicators, as a percentage of the gross domestic product is 4.62%. And out of that, very limited percentage, you have 51% spent by the people. And this is what we called out-of-pocket expenditure. And the higher the out-of-pocket expenditure, the worse the situation of the country is. Distribution of services in Sudan, even before the war and over the decades, has favored urban centers at the expense of rural areas. And this has had a severe impact during this war. Thank you. Next, please. So let's delve into the impact of the war. The war in Sudan, or the situation in Sudan, actually can be described as a complex humanitarian emergency. And that's by definition a situation where there is need for large-scale, multifaceted humanitarian assistance and multi-tiered response by the UN and humanitarian actors, country offices, regional offices, and headquarters. So a system-wide mobilization is needed to respond to such crisis. It is also the largest internal displacement situation in the world. We have around 14 million people displaced out of the population, which is around 50 million individuals. The numbers of IDPs were a little bit contested, moving between 11 million to 14 million. And right now, some people have returned, even though they have returned to unsafe situations. But the number is basically around that. And out of these, there is around 4 million who've crossed international borders to neighboring countries. The conflict is characterized by extensive violence, loss of lives, massive displacement of populations, and widespread damage to societies, to economies, and to property. And this is seen in the destruction of schools, hospitals, banks, and all of the government facilities, in addition to private property, people's homes and businesses and everything like that. One of the major characteristics is the hindrance of humanitarian assistance. The aid routes have been blocked by the warring parties, and this only makes it difficult for the people and warrants the definition of a complex humanitarian emergency. On top of that, there is significant security risk for humanitarian aid workers. And I think we all felt this because when the war hit, The United Nations and humanitarian agencies had to evacuate their international staff to neighboring countries. They had to remain there until they could return safely. Of course, I am a humanitarian aid worker, but I have to admit to the criticism of the UN and international actors that when a conflict hits, we leave the people to fend for themselves. So this is something for self-reflection for the UN and international humanitarian actors. On top of this, I have to mention the impact of climate change. We have witnessed floods in Gadarif. Literally, the patients in their hospital beds were flooded by the water. So people had to run, and Al Gadarif Hospital was one of the hospitals of refuge, as we consider it. And not only that, hospitals and schools were used as shelters for internally displaced persons. And in Sudan, due to the unequal pattern of development, what we see is that when somebody is sick in Darfur or in Kordofan, they go to Al Jazeera or Khartoum in order to receive treatment, and there is no shelter support, nothing. So our people, like the NGOs and so on, have created some sort of safety nets around the hospitals in order to accommodate the people. And this is from before the war, let alone during such war and massive displacement. Next, please. These are some figures, statistics from the humanitarian needs overview of this year. It is done every year and renewed every year. Out of the 50 million population, it's now standing at 51 million plus, actually. 30 million plus are in need of humanitarian assistance. Half of the population is facing acute food insecurity, and as a percentage of those are facing famine, as we'll see in a minute. 5 million children and pregnant women, breastfeeding pregnant women, breastfeeding and pregnant women and girls are suffering from malnutrition. And 2 million are in famine, as I have mentioned, and facing a risk of famine based on specific classification that we'll see in a minute. 10 million have been displaced internally, 4 million have crossed the borders to neighboring countries. Next, please. What about the health situation? There have been multiple and repeated communicable disease outbreaks, such as cholera, measles, dengue, hemorrhagic fever, chikungunya. Some of these diseases are endemic in Sudan. We are also witnessing the emergence and re-emergence of some outbreaks, and this is such a dire sign. It's like an alarm sign for us, and it really signifies the destruction of the health system and its inability to respond to the outbreaks. Over 70% of the hospitals and health facilities in the war-affected areas have been destroyed and deemed non-functional. This situation continues to linger. Some of them are reopened, but they are hit again, time and again, bombarded or through ground attacks and so on. There is massive, yet still untracked, and unfortunately so, death from chronic non-communicable diseases. And the narratives of this war are really horrible. You hear stories of people who just say, my aunt or dad or grandparent has not been able to receive their diabetes medication for so and so time. They go into complications and then there is loss of life. And these statistics, very unfortunately, have never made their way into any medical statistics. They will never be recorded as direct death from this war. And this is really, I think it's a shame on humanity. There's also massive shortage of medicines and supplies, and the population is displaced, traumatized, and overburdened, including healthcare workers. They have not received their salaries for months upon end. They themselves are displaced, yet having to respond and take care of their families at the same time. So it's just an impossible situation. On top of that, the attacks on healthcare recorded by the WHO have reached 182 attacks, out of which, these are the various types of attack. And attacks on healthcare include death and injuries to staff and patients, looting of supplies and assets, and The number of deaths has reached 1,189. Next, please. Thank you. A quick overview of the food insecurity situation. This is what is called as the integrated phase classification, or sometimes you hear of the IPC classification. The slide might not be very clear, but I think there is an overwhelming orange into red color and then going into the deep maroon color. Basically, to simplify this and to make it easy to read, if you see yellow color, that means these regions are under food security stress. Orange is crisis, red is emergency, and the deep maroon is famine situation. And in simple terms, I don't see much yellow in this map. Only a very small area in Port Sudan where the government is now located. The rest of the country is hovering between crisis to emergency to famine. And the inset to the right side here, you see the areas that are white in the map because the map is dated earlier than the inset. These white areas have not been analyzed previously, but when they analyzed them, they found that these are the areas of famine, which is the deep maroon. So I think this is very telling, and it's very up to date to May 2025. Next, please. In terms of the water, sanitation, and hygiene situation, 17.3 million people lack access to basic level drinking water, and over half of the population lacks access to proper sanitation, and the displacement has really exacerbated that and complicated it further. The coverage of sanitation has regressed. When something stagnates, that's a regression. It's not improving and it's not moving forward, and there's more than 10 million people practicing open defecation. To me, as a public health specialist, that immediately means these are communicable diseases. These are food-related, sanitation-related, and all of that dire situation. People are sheltering in schools. They're also, and in some public facilities, they are overcrowding. And this is having its impact on a rise in diarrheal diseases, respiratory illnesses, and this is what we are dealing with on a daily basis in support of our Ministry of Health and our colleagues at the front line. And overall, the water, sanitation, and hygiene-related diseases are one of the leading causes of death for children under 5 under this war. This has also been complicated by the impacts of food security and the rising malnutrition situation, and disease outbreaks, conflict, blockage of humanitarian routes, and ultimately morbidity and mortality of not only the children, but people with disabilities, elderly persons, and people who are generally living with chronic diseases, who are among the most vulnerable in this case. We can't talk about the war in Sudan without stopping and talking about sexual and gender-based violence. It has been documented as widespread, and it's being used as a weapon of war. And the Sudan fact-finding mission of the United Nations has attributed most of the attacks, and this is generated from the reports received by the fact-finding mission to the rapid support forces. The SGBV as a practice started from the kickstart of the war in Khartoum and then spread to other parts of the country as the war spread. The ages of victims ranged from a few months all the way to over 70 years. And this is really appalling. In Khartoum and other big cities, the RSF used some slurs that are signaling privilege or class. They were insulting people as you are the ones who have the utmost privilege in the country. But in order for you to see that this is not really out of any moral concern, the same pattern happened in Darfur, yet they used racial slurs to undermine the women. So it's very pragmatic, and it's being moved around in terms of the justification for something that is unjustifiable. So there has been a prime pattern of abductions, sex slavery, forced marriages, and trafficking in girls. Next, please. It's being used to humiliate women, to undermine the population, destroy the social fabrics, and sexual and gender-based violence has lasting effects, and it's been tormenting the entire society. The whole concept relies on spreading fear and causing bodily harm, physical, mental, planting mistrust within the society, and instilling a perpetual sense of shame among the victims and survivors. And for that reason, remedial actions would take decades to mend the structure and fabric of the society as the victims continue to live with the aftermath and their families. Sudan is going to bear a generation of children born to rape. And I just find this horrifying. The fact-finding mission report, the most recent report from September of this year, confirms receiving a large number of reports indicating, as I mentioned and I quote here, SGBV patterns including rape, gang rape, forced nudity, abduction, sexual slavery, and forced marriages. Thank you. Next, please. So what do we need to do in order for us to continue to rise above our pains and the suffering of our people? My people have a lot of resilience. We have always displayed that. So how can we capitalize on that and harness it? Overall, we need an immediate improvement of the humanitarian funding situation. We are seeing great deterioration in humanitarian funding. The USAID has pulled its money, it's been dismantled. And as Professor Alamin mentioned earlier, the humanitarian appeal is funded up to less than 25%. And it is done annually. And you wouldn't expect more funding to come at the end of the year. They usually kick-started at the beginning of the year or even before, and whatever money you receive is what you have for that year. We need diplomacy beyond vested interest, and I think Husam has given enough about the vested interests of regional actors. I cannot expect an actor who has a vested interest in Sudan's resources or is supporting one of the warring parties to act as an independent mediator. And I do believe that Canada is positioned in a good place to engage in diplomacy. And I think this is one of the things we need to encourage our country here to engage. In addition, of course, to the well-appreciated humanitarian response and the immigration response. We need opening and maintaining of the asylum space for Sudanese. The asylum space is shrinking around the world, and it's very important to maintain that space and to ensure that Sudanese are well received and immediately supported when they cross borders, either to neighboring countries or beyond. And the most important thing is justice, accountability, and reparation, and putting an end to the impunity, especially with regards to the sexual and gender-based violence crimes. And there is an opportunity to work with the Sudanese communities, both inside Sudan and in the diaspora. And Husam gave a good example of the emergency response rooms. We have the Sudan Solidarity Collective that has done a lot of good work. Our community associations, our doctors group has raised funds, and we collaborated actually with the University of Toronto students to support some of the hospitals that are receiving the majority of the IDPs. There are multiple good examples, and I think we need to pick up pace and continue to join hands together. And one of the most important things under this war is the attacks on human rights defenders. Lawyers around Sudan who are receiving the reports about gender-based violence or people who are receiving any complaints are being harassed, they are being detained, they are being even subjected to mass judgments and quick, like military tribunals, and there is enforced disappearances. And this is one of the areas that we need to make sure they are protected, not only within Sudan, but they are being harassed even in neighboring countries. We do have evidence of that. How can we do this? I would like to just shed light on the best approaches, if I may call them. Coordination, putting our hands together, as I mentioned. Coordination helps a lot because by pooling our resources and programming together, we avoid duplication and we utilize the meager resources that we have in the best way. And then localization. We need to tailor whichever support that we're delivering to what the people really need and enable and strengthen local leadership. Localization also in humanitarian terms has a specific definition that you cut the intermediaries. So if you have a donor, for example, that the traditional way of acting is a donor gives to a UN agency that sometimes gives to an international NGO that partners with local NGOs that further trickles the money down to what is called CBOs. And what's called CBOs and currently sits at the bottom of the scale is actually the ones leading the response. So we need a radical shift and a paradigm shift in delivering humanitarian aid. We also need a rights-based approach. It's not charity. It's not a top-down money that is given to the poor. These people have agency and we need to work with them and strengthen their agency and enable them. Working through a rights-based approach means access to health, food, water, the right to life are emphasized as we program. And finally, it has to be people-centered as I think being people-centered does not need an explanation. But it's very important when we are responding to, for example, sexual and gender-based violence, and later on when we hopefully, after the end of this war, when we think of reparations, people have lost not only family members, but we have to acknowledge they lost assets, they lost property, and it has to be approached in that way. Thank you so much. Next.
The complexities and of the worst and the various factors at play. And thank you, Dr. Iman, for shedding light on the devastating human impact it has had on Sudanese civilians. Oftentimes, when we are presented with so much information about the sad realities of the world, it can feel emotionally overwhelming, and it's natural to feel that way. So before we continue, let's take a brief moment to pause, ground ourselves, and reflect. I invite you all to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and as you exhale, open your eyes and take a look around this room. We see a diverse group of attendees, from students, faculty, community members, and allies. Some are Sudanese, others are not. Each of us bring different identities, experiences, and perspectives that have led us here today. This leads me to ask, what compels you to learn more about Sudan? Take a minute to reflect on this, and if you feel comfortable, share your thoughts with your neighbor.
Practically cannot just give them a free hand. Yes, the army is supposedly defending the sovereignty of the Sudan. However, this does not give the army any right to commit atrocities, to besiege the population. And we have seen this happening from the beginning of the war, to prevent people from accessing very basic resources like water, shelter, food, and human safety. So that's my answer to this question. Now, the painful point raised by Irania about how can we ensure that there is a genuine partnership that is dynamic and going as fast as is needed. It took a while, and I say this and keep me on record on this. It took a while, it took a few months to convince the quote unquote international organizations to really come down and consider these frontliners as partners. A second point, I would like to draw a comparison between a country like Sudan and a country like Syria, for example. The traditional way of acting when a crisis hits, for example, in Syria, the UN was approaching the delivery of aid through two options: cross-border, which is from neighboring countries, and that was from Turkey mostly, to the parts that are not controlled by the Assad government, and cross-line, when the situation improved, when the UN could negotiate access and move from the Assad-controlled zones towards the other areas controlled by other warring parties. In Sudan, this was impossible to do. Yet to come to this realization, it still took a while. And I think we have paid the price in terms of people's lives, because the distribution of control of areas in Sudan is checkered like a chessboard. So you can't move easily from one area to the other and deliver aid. Aid is being looted. And to your question about why are people hungry? People are hungry because of failure of agricultural seasons, multiple and repeatedly. Sudan is vastly an agricultural country. People are reliant on planting, harvesting, and keeping for next year. When the people were displaced from Khartoum and went to Adi Halfa and so on, guess what? The narrative we were hearing from my friends and their extended families is that the people of Khartoum came and drained our resources. People in Halfa who never needed to fetch crops in the market had to do this because their resources for next year were drained because they hosted the IDPs. The IDPs for many months since the start of the war, the IDPs were hosted by the local communities with no international aid. So this drained the resources of those who were sheltering and providing a safety net. And that is why right now everybody's resources are drained. And another aspect is the diaspora. It's these people sitting around here from Sudan. Has any one of you not sent a dime or penny since the war started? No. We have directed all our resources towards the Sudan, inside the country and in surrounding countries. Those people now living in Egypt and in the UAE and in Uganda and scattered around the world are being supported by the diaspora. This is yet another blind spot that nobody talks about. People have had to sell property in order to bring their families through this program in Canada. And these are things we need to talk about. Thank you, and I hand over. I hope I answered all your questions.
Thank you very much for the questions, for the comments. Thank you, Iman, for the answers. I cannot even begin to claim that I have answers to all the questions that are. I mean, even the first, the first set of questions, I don't have time. No one here has time to answer all these questions. So I'll try to go, group some of them and answer as much as I can. So a quick history of why South Sudan got independence and why we have the wars, why we have repeated wars. And this question is actually, I'll take it with and link it to the Ahmed's question about are the people ready, and maybe the solution. So Sudan, well, there are, so the liberal peace building that has played a role in trying to bring peace to Sudan for the past few decades, tried to simplify the Sudanese problems to ethnicity or religion. So the North Sudan, which is Muslim Arab, against South Sudan, which is non-Muslim, non-Arab, or African and non-Muslim. And so when Darfur's war was, okay, all the Darfurians are Muslims, so it was, well, Arabs against against Africans. I think most of Sudan's wars can be not reduced, but can be explained by conflicts over resources, and this is a very scientific body of knowledge about this, that all these wars started as conflicts over resources, and so but in addition to the resources, they when the post-colonial governments took over, so these conflicts over resources became conflicts over developmental needs and requirements of the people, and how the governments in the center treated the peripheries. And the the wars that started, or the conflicts that started again, like around resources, became quickly wars of identity because of the elites, the leaders of the marginalized people that like became the leaders of the resistance or the leaders of the rebels in the south or in the west or even in the east or even in the north. So resources and development and giving the people the means to produce, to live decent lives, and to have their basic services. This can explain the war in the south, and the war in the south. There is also a history of how the colonial power, the UK or the Britain, how Britain tried, because it was not determined on what to do with this South Sudan, whether it becomes, after Sudan gets independence, it becomes a part of Sudan, or it becomes part of Eastern Africa, or becomes an independent country. So there is a legacy of the colonial rule there in South Sudan. But it was all through the fact that the people in the South did not have control over their resources. The central government did not listen and did not actually do what it had to do to build an economy that would serve all, and then to build a nation that everyone would have their voices in. After that, so this led to the war, the first civil war in 1955, a few months before the independence of Sudan. It went all through until 1972, when there was a peace agreement. Then it was ignited again in 1983 until the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, was reached in 2005. That ended by a referendum in 2010 and 11. So South Sudan got its independence in 2011. So what this means to the solution is it's we have to, everyone in Sudan has to have everyone in Sudan has to see themselves in the country. It's not only a matter of identity. The problem is when it becomes an identity issue, it becomes more complex, and it brings people, lets people die for no reason. And you know, at the end of the day, that their leaders will at one point go and sit in some resort. We kind of finished all the resorts in Kenya and Tanzania and Abuja in Nigeria and Doha, and then reach a settlement which basically redistributes the seats in the cabinet towards these rebels, and nothing will come back to the people who died. So it's not we have to clearly identify, it's not an identity issue. Everyone in Sudan is, like, all the masses are suffering because of the decisions made by the elites that govern this country before its independence and after its independence. And this war, if we try to, the soldiers that are fighting this war, so if we forget Hemeti and Burhan, are coming from the poor of the poor of the country, whether they are in the RSF or in SAF. They are poor. This is for many years. Darfur, which is one of the richest areas of Sudan, was left out of the production. People would grow crops, would herd cattle and livestock, but what they will gain is a fraction of the economic gains that goes to the rich and that goes to the outside, I mean, the other countries. So this left many generations in Darfur, like in the other parts of Sudan, with no option but to join militias or the army, because that's the only option they have. So how we're going to tackle this, Ahmed? Whether are we ready is the Sudanese people ready for democracy? We are. I mean, but it's a struggle. How are we going to? I mean, that's also another question. What is the solution? There is no simple answer to this. So we can say that in the short term, we need the war to stop. There is no question about that. We need the war to stop. In my view, and I think this is also answering a few questions about the role of the diaspora, Khalda, you asked. And so what we need to do here, I think that we need to be very clear on what role the international community has to do. Because the international community, and there are, so is it the US, is it Canada, is it the UAE, is it, the international community can, well, they can go back to doing what they always want to do. So they have these mediation and peace building exercises. But actually, I would like to see the international community as far as they can, as possible, from this conflict on this regard. What they need to do is simply lifting. So one of the main things that they could do is pressuring the external countries that are fueling this war. This is something they can do. And this is something that we and the diaspora have to continue to do or to demand. So lift your arms from Sudan, from fueling the war. This is one. Providing humanitarian assistance to the Sudanese people, because, and I like Dr. Iman's explanation to this, that this is a rights-based thing. So this is the right of these people. It's not charity. So, but leave the peace building to the Sudanese people. How we can do this, knowing that the civilian forces or civilian powers are fragmented, a lot of them, so the traditional civilian powers, many of the political parties are aligned with the external countries, with the outside world. They are representing the elites that actually led us to this chaos, one of the reasons that led us to this chaos. I believe in the grassroots, grassroots organization, the resistance committees, the emergency response rooms, and many other organizations. But I know that building these organizations will take time. But frankly, we have no other option. I don't see an alternative. Whether this will take 5 years or 50 years, we spent 70 years from our independence, almost 70 years, 69 years now under war, trying to find shortcuts to these wars that led us nowhere. And every single cycle is worse than the previous one. So are we ready for democracy? Yes, we are. But we need to continue struggling, knowing that probably it will not be in my watch, but hopefully within Ahmed's watch and many of the people here, the young people here. We have no other alternative. What else? So the legitimacy question, I could not have answered it better than Dr. Iman. The fact is, in 69 years of independence, we had less than 12 years maybe of democratic rules, and even the democratic governments did not really come with elections that represented the whole country. So even the democratic governments, the civilian governments were not always fully representing the country. But internationally speaking, well, if we look at the international law, from the international law, there is no void in power in Sudan. This de facto government is, well, whether it is the legitimate government or not, it's not for me, it's not legitimate. It's like Umar al-Bashir's government, who lasted for 29 years or 30 years, it was not legitimate in my eyes. Nimeris ruled us for 16 years and Aboud for 8 years. They were not legitimate. But under the international law, they are the de facto governments. There is no void of authorities there. There is no there is no power void in Sudan. It's as illegitimate as Al-Sisi is illegitimate in Ethiopia, as Abiy Ahmed is illegitimate in Ethiopia, as Libya is fractured, Chad is fractured. All the Gulf countries are illegitimate too. So if we have to be clear here. So the army committed and is committing atrocities as we speak. And we have to stand and we have to say this is very clearly. But so it remains more representative of the social fabric of the country than the RSF. There is no hint of legitimacy to the RSF nor to Niala government. Let's also be very clear here. So the demands of the Sudanese revolutionaries was العسكر للثكنات والجنجويد الحل. So the army is back to the barracks. This is their demand. But the RSF, the Janjaweed, is to be dismantled. So there is no legitimacy there. We should not even try, and this is very clear. What else? I think there was a question from Haneen. You did not mention your name, but it's also part of what in the diaspora should we do more. Unfortunately, the division and polarization in everything Sudanese is very damaging, but we have to start to treat it as a fact of life. We will not have social organizations or civilian organizations that will have everyone agreeing to. But this should not stop us from doing what we can with the people that we have, trying to expand the spheres of who will be part of what we do. Khalda, I think this is also part of what we need to do with our communities here. We need to be clear on what they can do. They need to play a political role. I agree with you. And in the political role means being more engaged in the politics of our second homes that we live in now. So it's not being engaged only in the Sudanese issue, because the Sudanese issue is not attractive to the politics of the country, Canada or the US where I live. But we have to be part of the local politics of where we live. And within that frame, we bring the Sudanese case to a larger audience. Not sure if, again, I can spend hours talking about these points, but this is the time I think we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, for your words.
I want a quick word to Ahmed. I think democracy comes through dialogue, and not dialogue held in the fancy hotels and all of these places, but dialogue amongst the small groups like your collective with the youth inside Sudan and so on, and amongst ourselves, even here in Canada. I'm sure you wouldn't find 100% agreement of opinions. So start with smaller groups, holding dialogues, community-based, and let's bring what's in our hearts, because keeping that bottled in has led to the current divisions. And when it festers, it gets really ugly. So let's bring that out. Thank you.
Thinking about dialogues, and through these dialogues, we can take all these tangible solutions that Mr. Husam and Dr. Iman gave us and we can return home to a free Sudan. So thank you all for joining us today. Your powerful and informative, nuanced presentations. We have small gifts here that I'm gonna. Thank you. How will you be here today feeling fair? Because I think one of the things that they both highlighted is that civilians, emergency response rooms, rescue committees, etc., are running an entire country in the absence of a functional state. And that, I think, should give us a lot of hope. I want you to be here committed to doing something. So I want you to talk to Rania about joining the Sudanese Community Association. Join the Student Union if you're a student. Join the Sudan Solidarity Collective if you want to help us fundraise and organize and advocate. This will be outside with a sign-up sheet. And please now join us outside for a quick reception because we have to kind of get out of here relatively soon. I'm Phoenix Iceland Restaurant, which is delicious snack, food and snack and drink. Thank you so much for doing.